My name is Charlotte Reed. I'm 28 years old, and I just watched my 23-year-old sister Victoria pour gasoline on my designer wardrobe worth over $60,000 and set it on fire in our parents' backyard because I refused to give her $17,000 for a study abroad program in Italy. What made this arson even more shocking was that Victoria had absolutely no idea I'd been secretly paying her entire $32,000 annual university tuition for the past 4 years, and that the clothes she was burning belonged to the person who was the only reason she was still enrolled in college. I've spent the last 6 years building a successful career as a fashion consultant in Los Angeles, working with boutique owners, personal stylists, and emerging designers to help them refine their collections and marketing strategies. My job requires me to maintain an extensive professional wardrobe because I'm essentially a walking advertisement for fashion expertise, and clients need to see that I understand style, quality, and current trends. Over the years, I'd built a collection worth over $60,000 through industry connections, sample sales, professional discounts, and strategic investments in classic pieces that would serve me for decades. My wardrobe included designer dresses from brands like Valentino, Carolina Herrera, and Oscar de la Renta that I'd purchased at industry sample sales for a fraction of retail price. I had tailored blazers, silk blouses, cashmere sweaters, leather jackets, and a shoe collection that represented years of careful curation and professional networking. Every piece served a purpose in my work, creating the polished image that fashion industry clients expected from a consultant. They were paying for expertise. But what Victoria and my parents didn't know was that while I was building this professional wardrobe and establishing my career, I'd also been secretly funding Victoria's expensive private university education. 4 years ago, when Victoria was accepted to Westmont University with its $32,000 annual tuition, our parents, Ronald and Susan, couldn't afford to send her. My father's manufacturing business had failed 2 years earlier, leaving him with significant debt and forcing him to take a management position at a company where he'd once been an owner. My mother's income as a medical office administrator wasn't enough to cover Victoria's college costs, and Victoria hadn't received any substantial scholarships. The situation had been devastating for my parents, who had always assumed they'd be able to fund their children's education the way their own parents had funded theirs. Watching them struggle with the reality that they couldn't give Victoria the college experience she wanted was painful, and I'd made a decision that I thought was generous, but that I now understand was enabling. I offered to pay Victoria's tuition anonymously through my parents, letting Victoria believe that somehow they'd found a way to afford her education. Every semester for 4 years, I'd been transferring $16,000 to my parents' account, with strict instructions that Victoria never know where the money came from. I'd paid over $128,000 for Victoria's education while living modestly myself, prioritizing her tuition over my own savings, investments, and lifestyle expenses. I'd done this because I believed families should support each other, because I wanted Victoria to have opportunities I'd worked hard to create for myself, and because I thought this sacrifice would be meaningful, even if Victoria never knew about it. But instead of gratitude for the education she was receiving, Victoria had developed an increasingly entitled attitude toward me and my career success. She resented that I worked in fashion, claiming it was superficial compared to her psychology major. She criticized my wardrobe as excessive and materialistic, while demanding I buy her designer items she couldn't afford. She'd started treating me like a personal ATM, asking for money for spring break trips, concert tickets, new laptops, and various expenses that she claimed were educational necessities. My parents, Ronald and Susan, enabled this behavior by suggesting I should be more generous with Victoria because I had more money and she was still in school. They never acknowledged that the only reason Victoria was in school was because I was funding her tuition. They never questioned where the money for her education was coming from, or how they were supposedly affording $32,000 annually when they could barely cover their own expenses. They simply accepted the fiction that somehow they were providing for Victoria's college education, and they used that fiction to pressure me into additional financial support. Have you ever sacrificed enormously for someone who treated you with contempt because they didn't know about the sacrifice? 3 weeks ago, Victoria called me demanding $17,000 for a summer study abroad program in Italy. She explained that the program would enhance her resume, that all her friends were going, and that she deserved this experience after working hard in school. When I asked if she'd applied for scholarships or program funding, she became defensive, saying I was being difficult and that I should just give her the money since I spent thousands on clothes. I tried to explain that my professional wardrobe was a business investment, that I couldn't just hand her $17,000, and that she should explore other funding options for study abroad. But Victoria escalated immediately, accusing me of being selfish, claiming I didn't care about her education, and saying I was jealous that she'd get to experience Italy while I was stuck working in boring fashion. The conversation ended badly, with Victoria hanging up on me after I definitively said I wouldn't be funding her Italy trip. I assumed that would be the end of it, that she'd complain to our parents and move on like she always did when I refused her demands. What I didn't anticipate was that Victoria's entitlement and resentment had reached a level where she genuinely believed she had the right to destroy my property as punishment for not giving her money. 2 days later, my parents called asking me to come to their house in Orange County for a family discussion about Victoria's education and opportunities. I drove down Saturday morning expecting another intervention, where they'd pressure me to fund Victoria's Italy trip, armed with arguments about why I couldn't afford it and why Victoria needed to take financial responsibility for optional programs. When I arrived, Victoria was in the backyard with several large black garbage bags, and I could see pieces of fabric hanging out of them. My stomach dropped as I recognized the distinctive patterns of several dresses I owned, and I ran to the backyard, realizing with horror what I was seeing. Victoria had broken into my Los Angeles apartment using a spare key I'd given my parents for emergencies. She'd taken almost my entire professional wardrobe: dresses, blazers, coats, shoes, accessories, and brought it all to my parents' house. And now she was standing in the backyard pouring gasoline from a red container over the clothes she'd piled in the middle of their lawn. "Victoria, what are you doing?" I screamed, running toward her. "Those are my clothes. That's my entire professional wardrobe." She looked at me with an expression of pure hatred and entitlement. "You said you couldn't afford to support my education," Victoria said, her voice shaking with rage. "You said you needed your money for clothes instead of helping family. So I'm showing you what I think of your priorities." Before I could reach her, Victoria pulled out a lighter and set the gasoline-soaked pile on fire. Flames erupted immediately, engulfing designer dresses I'd worn to important industry events, blazers I'd had custom-tailored, coats that had taken me years to find and afford, shoes I'd bought at exclusive sample sales. I watched thousands of dollars of professional wardrobe burn, while my sister stood there with a satisfied expression, apparently believing she was teaching me a lesson about family priorities. I turned to my parents, who were standing on their patio watching the destruction, expecting them to be as horrified as I was. "Call the police," I shouted. "She just committed arson. She stole my property and set it on fire." But instead of calling the police or even condemning Victoria's actions, my mother said something that revealed exactly how distorted my family's perception had become. "Charlotte, maybe if you'd been more supportive of your sister's educational opportunities, she wouldn't have felt the need to do something this extreme. You pushed her to this by being selfish with your money." The victim blaming was so outrageous that I couldn't initially respond. My sister had committed arson, destroying over $60,000 worth of my property, and my mother was suggesting I deserved it for not funding a study abroad trip. My father was nodding in agreement, apparently also believing that refusing to give Victoria $17,000 justified her burning my professional wardrobe. I stood there watching years of careful wardrobe curation burn, while my family justified the destruction because I hadn't been sufficiently generous with someone who had no idea I'd already given her over $128,000 for college tuition. The irony was so extreme that I started laughing, a harsh sound that had nothing to do with humor. "What's so funny?" Victoria demanded, clearly annoyed that I wasn't reacting with the devastation she'd been hoping for. "You have no idea what you just did," I said, pulling out my phone. "You have absolutely no idea. I took photos and videos of the burning clothes, Of Victoria standing near the fire with the gasoline container, of my parents watching without intervening. Then I turned and walked back to my car while my family called after me asking where I was going and demanding I stay to talk through this family conflict. I didn't respond. I was done talking. I was done enabling. I was done protecting people who had just demonstrated they believed I deserved to have my property destroyed through arson because I wouldn't fund optional educational luxuries. And I was especially done funding the college education of someone who had just burned my professional wardrobe because she felt entitled to even more of my money. My relationship with Victoria and my enabling parents had been complicated long before the arson incident, defined by patterns of entitlement, resentment, and distorted family dynamics that I'd been trying to navigate for years. Understanding how we got to a point where my sister felt justified committing arson requires understanding the years of dysfunction that preceded it. Growing up, Victoria and I had a fairly normal sister relationship despite our 5-year age gap. I was the responsible older sister who excelled academically and professionally, while Victoria was the creative younger sister who was more interested in social activities than achievements. Our parents treated us differently but not unfairly, understanding that we had different strengths and interests. The shift in family dynamics began when I was 22 and Victoria was 17. That was the year my father's manufacturing business failed due to a combination of increased foreign competition, rising costs, and some poor financial decisions he'd made trying to expand too quickly. The business collapse was devastating for our family financially and emotionally. My father went from being a successful business owner to being unemployed with significant debt, and the stress affected every aspect of our family functioning. My mother increased her hours at the medical office where she worked, but her administrator salary wasn't enough to maintain the lifestyle our family had become accustomed to. My parents had to sell our family home and move into a smaller rental property. They had to liquidate retirement savings to pay business debts. They had to completely restructure their financial expectations and accept that their economic security had been destroyed. Victoria was entering her senior year of high school when this happened, and the timing was particularly difficult because she'd been planning to attend expensive private universities. She'd always assumed our parents would pay for her education the way they'd paid for mine, not understanding that the financial situation had changed dramatically. When she was accepted to Westmont University with its $32,000 annual tuition and minimal scholarship support, the reality of our family's financial collapse became impossible to ignore. I watched my parents struggle with the guilt of not being able to give Victoria the college experience she wanted. My father was particularly devastated, feeling like he'd failed as a provider because his business mistakes were preventing his daughter from accessing education. My mother would cry discussing Victoria's future, worried that financial limitations would restrict her opportunities and potential. That's when I made the offer that seemed generous at the time, but that I now understand enabled years of entitlement. I told my parents I'd pay Victoria's tuition anonymously, letting her believe they'd somehow found funding for her education. I was 22, newly established in my fashion consulting career, earning good money but not wealthy by any means. Committing to pay $32,000 annually was a significant sacrifice that would require me to live modestly, delay buying property, and prioritize Victoria's education over my own financial security. But I believed it was the right thing to do. I believed families should support each other during difficult times. I believed Victoria deserved educational opportunities regardless of our parents' financial situation. And I believed my sacrifice would be meaningful, even if Victoria never knew about it. My parents accepted my offer with overwhelming gratitude, promising to never tell Victoria where the money came from and maintaining the fiction that somehow they were still providing for her education. This deception seemed harmless at first, but it created a foundation of lies that distorted Victoria's understanding of family finances and her own situation. For 4 years, Victoria attended Westmont University, believing our parents were paying her tuition. She never questioned how they could afford $32,000 annually when they could barely cover their own rent. She never wondered where the money came from or what sacrifices were being made to fund her education. She simply accepted that somehow she was entitled to an expensive private university experience, and she built her entire identity around being a Westmont student without understanding the actual cost. Meanwhile, I was transferring $16,000 to my parents every semester, watching my savings account remain stagnant, delaying purchasing property, and living far more modestly than my income would have otherwise allowed. I was making significant financial sacrifices so Victoria could have experiences she treated as entitlements rather than privileges. But instead of the sacrifice creating gratitude or family closeness, it somehow created resentment and entitlement. Victoria began treating me with increasing contempt as she progressed through college, apparently viewing my career success as evidence that I should be doing even more to financially support her lifestyle. She'd make comments about how my fashion consulting work was superficial compared to her psychology studies. She'd criticize my professional wardrobe as excessive, while asking me to buy her designer clothes she wanted. She'd demand money for spring break trips, claiming I should fund her experiences because I made good money in fashion. She'd compare my lifestyle to hers and express resentment that I had more financial freedom than she did, never connecting that freedom to the fact that I wasn't in school because I'd started working immediately to build my career. My parents enabled this attitude by consistently suggesting I should be more generous with Victoria. "She's still in school," my mother would say when I hesitated to fund Victoria's various demands. "You have a good career and you can afford to help her. Families should support each other." The irony of being told I should support Victoria more while I was literally paying her entire tuition was overwhelming, but I'd committed to keeping the funding secret, so I couldn't defend myself by revealing the extent of my existing support. Have you ever been criticized for not being generous enough by people who had no idea how much you were already sacrificing? The dynamics reached a crisis point during Victoria's senior year when she began demanding larger amounts of money for what she called educational investments. She wanted me to fund a new laptop, pay for a prestigious internship program, buy her professional clothes for interviews, and cover the costs of graduate school application fees. Each request came with implications that I was selfish if I refused, that my career success obligated me to fund her professional development, and that refusing made me a bad sister. I tried to establish boundaries, explaining that I couldn't fund every expense she wanted and that she needed to take some financial responsibility for her own future. But Victoria interpreted my boundaries as personal rejection, becoming increasingly hostile and resentful toward me. The Italy study abroad demand was the culmination of this escalating entitlement. Victoria didn't ask if I could afford to give her $17,000. She demanded it as if I owed her the money, as if my refusal was a betrayal rather than a reasonable boundary. And when I said no, she apparently believed she had the right to destroy my property as punishment. The arson wasn't an impulsive act of rage. Victoria had broken into my apartment, transported my wardrobe to my parents' house, obtained gasoline, and planned the destruction. This was premeditated, calculated revenge for not receiving money she felt entitled to, but had no right to demand, and my parents had watched it happen, apparently believing I deserved to have my property burned because I'd refused to fund an optional educational luxury. What none of them knew was that the person whose property they were destroying and whose boundaries they were violating was the only reason Victoria was still enrolled at Westmont University. The sister whose professional wardrobe Victoria had burned was the same person who'd paid $128,000 over 4 years so Victoria could have the college experience she took completely for granted. As I drove back to Los Angeles after watching my wardrobe burn, I made several decisions that would permanently change my relationship with my family. The first decision was practical. I was done funding Victoria's education. The second decision was strategic. I wasn't going to tell anyone I was stopping the payments until Victoria discovered it naturally. And the third decision was emotional. I was done protecting people who had just shown me they believed I deserved to be punished through property destruction for establishing reasonable financial boundaries. I spent the rest of Saturday documenting the financial abuse I'd experienced, the arson Victoria had committed, and my parents' complicity in the destruction. I had photos of the burning clothes, videos of Victoria admitting she'd done it, and witnesses who had seen the entire incident. I had bank records showing the tuition payments I'd been making for 4 years. I had text messages from Victoria demanding money and threatening consequences if I didn't comply. Then I contacted Westmont University's Financial Services Department using their emergency weekend phone line. I explained that I needed to cancel an upcoming payment that was scheduled to process on Monday, and that I needed to remove my authorization for any future charges. The representative confirmed that a $16,000 semester balance payment was scheduled for Monday, that my cancellation would prevent that payment from processing, and that the student account would be flagged for unpaid tuition once the payment deadline passed. I also canceled Victoria's campus housing payment that I'd been covering, her meal plan that I'd been funding, and, most significantly, her off-campus apartment rent that I'd been paying directly to her landlord without anyone in my family knowing I was covering that expense too. Victoria lived in a nice 2-bedroom apartment that she believed our parents were somehow paying for, not realizing that I'd been covering $1,800 monthly rent in addition to her tuition. The total amount I'd been paying for Victoria annually was actually closer to $54,000 when you included tuition, housing, meal plan, and rent. That's $54,000 every year for someone who had just committed arson against my property, because I wouldn't give her an additional $17,000 for Italy. After canceling all the payments, I packed what had survived the fire, which wasn't much, maybe 15% of my total wardrobe, and began the process of documenting losses for potential legal action. The destroyed items were worth over $60,000 based on original purchase prices, though I'd paid significantly less through industry connections and sample sales. But even at the discounted prices I'd paid, Victoria had destroyed over $25,000 worth of property. On Sunday, I sent a single text message to my family group chat. Good luck. Then I blocked all of their numbers, blocked them on social media, and prepared to watch what happened when Victoria's carefully constructed college life collapsed because the person secretly funding it had withdrawn support. I didn't have to wait long for the consequences to begin. By Monday afternoon, I started receiving emails to my old email address from family members who had somehow obtained it, messages that revealed the chaos that was unfolding as Victoria discovered the reality of her financial situation. The first crisis was the tuition payment. When Monday's deadline passed without the scheduled payment processing, Westmont's Financial Services Department immediately placed a hold on Victoria's student account, preventing her from registering for classes, accessing her meal plan, or utilizing campus services. They sent Victoria an automated notice explaining that her semester balance was unpaid and that she needed to contact financial services immediately to resolve the issue or face academic suspension. Victoria apparently called our parents in a panic, demanding to know why the tuition payment hadn't processed. This must have been a devastating conversation because our parents suddenly realized they'd been accepting my tuition payments for 4 years without questioning where the money was actually coming from or what would happen if it stopped. When they tried to reach me to ask what had happened, they discovered I'd blocked their numbers. They apparently tried to log into the bank account where I'd been transferring tuition money and found that I'd removed my access and withdrawn the remaining balance that had been sitting there for the next semester's payment. The campus housing crisis emerged Tuesday when Victoria received an eviction notice for unpaid housing fees. She'd apparently assumed that her campus residence was being billed to the same mysterious payment source that covered her tuition, not realizing it was a separate charge I'd been paying directly. When that payment didn't process, the housing office immediately began eviction proceedings, giving Victoria 48 hours to pay the outstanding balance or vacate her campus apartment. The meal plan cancellation meant Victoria couldn't eat in the campus dining facilities, forcing her to use her own money for food. This might sound like a minor inconvenience, but for someone who'd been receiving free meals for 4 years and who had no job or savings because she'd never needed them, suddenly having to budget for daily food expenses created immediate financial stress. But the most significant crisis, the one that apparently caused the most panic, was the off-campus apartment situation. Victoria's landlord sent her an eviction notice Wednesday when the rent payment I'd been making didn't arrive. The notice explained that she had 5 days to pay the outstanding balance plus late fees or vacate the apartment she'd been living in for 2 years. This must have been particularly shocking because Victoria had believed our parents were paying her apartment rent. She'd been living in a nice 2-bedroom place, enjoying the space and independence, completely unaware that I'd been covering $1,800 monthly for years. When the landlord contacted her about unpaid rent, She must have realized that yet another aspect of her college life had been funded by the sister whose wardrobe she'd burned. The family members who were contacting me via my old email address were mostly trying to guilt me into restoring the payments, suggesting I was being cruel and vindictive by withdrawing financial support. But their messages revealed just how shocked everyone was to discover I'd been funding Victoria's education all along. One email from my aunt expressed disbelief. "Charlotte, your mother just told me you've been paying Victoria's tuition for 4 years? And her housing? And her apartment rent? None of us had any idea. We all thought your parents were somehow managing to afford Westmont. Why didn't you tell anyone?" Another email from my uncle tried to mediate. "I understand you're upset about what Victoria did to your clothes, and that was definitely wrong. But she's about to lose her housing and get suspended from school. Surely you don't want to ruin her entire education over a fight about clothes." The characterization of arson as a fight about clothes was typical of how my family minimized Victoria's destructive behavior. But what was interesting about these messages was that even family members who were trying to guilt me into restoring payments were acknowledging that they'd had no idea about the extent of my financial support, and that this revelation was shocking. My parents' messages, which they were sending via email and through relatives, were particularly desperate. They'd apparently told Victoria the truth about who had been funding her education, and Victoria's response to this revelation was evidently not the remorse and appreciation they'd been hoping for. One email my mother sent via my cousin said, "Victoria is devastated that you're withdrawing support right before her final semester. She says she'll apologize for the clothes incident if you'll continue paying her tuition. She didn't know you were the one funding her education, and she feels terrible about what happened. Please don't punish her for not knowing." The framing of Victoria's arson as a clothes incident and the suggestion that she deserved credit for offering to apologize was revealing. There was no acknowledgement that she'd committed a serious crime, no recognition that the clothes incident involved destroying over $60,000 of property, no understanding that an apology offered only after discovering financial consequences wasn't genuine remorse. But what was most striking about the family communications was how surprised everyone was to learn about my years of financial support. The revelation that I'd been paying Victoria's tuition, housing, meal plan, and apartment rent was apparently shocking to relatives who'd observed my family dynamics for years. They'd all watched Victoria treat me with contempt and entitlement. They'd heard her criticize my career and lifestyle. They'd witnessed her demanding money from me. But none of them had realized I was already providing massive financial support that Victoria knew nothing about. Have you ever revealed a sacrifice you'd been making secretly and watched people's entire perception of a situation change instantly? By Thursday, the crisis had intensified. Victoria had been officially suspended from classes due to unpaid tuition. She'd been evicted from campus housing, and her landlord had filed formal eviction proceedings for the off-campus apartment. She was facing the complete collapse of her college life, with only 1 semester remaining before graduation. The emails I was receiving had shifted from attempts at guilt to accusations that I was being vindictive and cruel. Several family members suggested I was using money as a weapon, and that withdrawing support was financial abuse. But none of them offered to pay Victoria's expenses themselves, and none of them acknowledged that I'd been providing that support voluntarily for 4 years, while being treated with resentment and entitlement. On Friday, I received an email from my father that revealed how desperately my family was trying to fix the situation without me. "Charlotte, we've applied for Parent Plus loans to cover Victoria's semester tuition, but we weren't approved because of my business debts. We've tried private student loans, but Victoria doesn't have credit history or a co-signer who's financially qualified. The university says she needs to pay the full $16,000 balance by next Friday, or she'll be withdrawn from the semester. Please reconsider. This is her final semester. She's so close to graduating." The email was striking because it revealed that my parents had finally confronted the reality they'd been avoiding for 4 years. They couldn't afford Victoria's education and had been depending on me to fund it while taking credit for providing it. Now that I'd withdrawn support, they were discovering that no alternative funding sources were available, and that Victoria's secure college situation had been entirely dependent on my continued generosity. I didn't respond to any of the family communications. I was done engaging with people who had watched me be abused financially and emotionally, who had enabled Victoria's arson, and who were now trying to guilt me into continuing to fund someone who destroyed my property because I wouldn't give her even more money. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my professional wardrobe using the money I was now saving by not funding Victoria's education and housing. The $54,000 annually that I'd been paying for Victoria's expenses was now available for my own use, and I was directing it toward replacing what had been destroyed and building an even better professional wardrobe than what I'd lost. I also consulted with an attorney about potential legal action against Victoria for the arson and against my parents for allowing it to happen on their property. The attorney explained that I had a strong civil case for the value of destroyed property, that Victoria had clearly committed criminal arson, and that my parents could potentially be liable as property owners who had permitted the destruction to occur. The decision about whether to pursue legal action was complicated by the fact that my family was already facing financial disaster due to my withdrawal of support. Filing a lawsuit would add additional stress and expense to people who were already struggling. But the attorney also pointed out that Victoria's arson was a serious crime that deserved legal consequences, and that my family's financial situation didn't excuse her destructive behavior or my parents' complicity in it. I decided to wait before making any decisions about legal action, wanting to see how my family responded to the crisis once the initial panic subsided. Would they take accountability for Victoria's arson and their enabling of it? Would they understand why I'd withdrawn support? Would they finally recognize the extent of the sacrifices I'd been making for years? The answer came 2 weeks after I'd canceled the payments, when Victoria sent an email to my old address that revealed exactly how little she'd learned from the entire experience. The email was not the humble apology I might have hoped for, but rather a continuation of the entitlement that had led to the arson in the first place. Victoria's email began with a minimal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. "I'm sorry I burned your clothes. I was angry and I didn't think about how much they were worth to you. I understand now that you'd been paying for my school all along, and I appreciate that even though I didn't know about it." But the email quickly shifted to complaints about the consequences she was facing. "But now I'm about to lose everything because you're being vindictive. I'm suspended from classes 1 semester before graduation. I'm evicted from my apartment with nowhere to go. I can't afford food or basic necessities. My entire future is being destroyed because you're punishing me for one mistake." The characterization of arson as one mistake and the suggestion that I was being vindictive by withdrawing support showed that Victoria still didn't understand the magnitude of what she'd done or why it had consequences. She was still framing herself as the victim of my cruelty, rather than as someone who'd committed a serious crime and was now facing natural consequences. The email concluded with a demand disguised as a request. "If you really care about me finishing my education, you need to pay my tuition and housing for this final semester. After I graduate, I won't ask you for anything else, but I deserve the chance to finish what I started." The entitlement in that email, the suggestion that I owed her continued funding after she'd committed arson against my property, that I should pay for her final semester while receiving nothing in return except a promise she wouldn't ask for more money, was so extreme that I forwarded it to my attorney as additional evidence of Victoria's character and lack of genuine remorse. I sent one final email to my entire family, making it clear that I was done being their financial resource and emotional scapegoat. I paid $128,000 for Victoria's education over 4 years while being treated with contempt and entitlement. I paid her housing, meal plan, and apartment rent without anyone knowing, adding another $80,000 to my total contribution. I sacrificed my own financial security to give Victoria opportunities she treated as entitlements rather than privileges. When I established a reasonable boundary by refusing to fund a study abroad program, Victoria responded by committing arson against my professional wardrobe, destroying over $60,000 of property. You all watched this happen and suggested I deserved it for not being generous enough. I'm done funding, enabling, and absorbing abuse from people who believe I owe them unlimited financial support, regardless of how they treat me. Victoria's college situation is now her problem to solve, not mine. I never received responses to that email because I immediately changed my email address and ensured my family had no way to contact me. I'd said everything that needed to be said, and I had no interest in their justifications, excuses, or continued attempts to manipulate me into restoring support. 6 months after the arson and the withdrawal of financial support, my life had transformed in ways that demonstrated the freedom that comes from refusing to enable destructive people. The $54,000 annually that I was no longer spending on Victoria's education and living expenses had allowed me to rebuild my professional wardrobe with even better pieces than what had been destroyed. I'd purchased a condo in Los Angeles using the savings I was finally accumulating. I'd invested in my business, expanding my consulting practice and increasing my income substantially. Meanwhile, I'd learned through a former friend that Victoria had been forced to withdraw from Westmont University after she couldn't pay the semester balance. She'd moved back home with our parents and was apparently working retail while trying to save money to potentially complete her degree at a less expensive school. The promising future she'd envisioned as a Westmont graduate with an impressive resume was gone, replaced by the reality that arson has consequences. My parents had apparently taken out a home equity loan to help Victoria pay some of her debts, further damaging their already precarious financial situation. They were reportedly struggling and resentful, though whether they were resentful of Victoria for committing arson or resentful of me for withdrawing support was unclear. What was clear was that I'd finally established boundaries that protected me from a family that had been exploiting my generosity while treating me with contempt. I'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people experience the natural consequences of their actions, even when those consequences are severe and permanent. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever discovered that people you were supporting secretly were treating you with entitlement and disrespect? How did you handle situations where family members destroyed your property and expected you to continue funding their lifestyle? Your story might help someone else facing similar dynamics. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And remember that people who destroy your property through arson will be very surprised to discover they were burning belongings of the person secretly funding their entire life. See you in our next story here on Her Sweet Revenge.